The murder of Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nurse, in February 1986, became one of Los Angeles' most notorious cold cases. The crime remained unsolved for over 2 decades, until a shocking discovery unearthed a dark and personal connection between Rasmussen's murder and a member of the LAPD. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957. An intelligent and hardworking student, she graduated high school at 16 and from college at the age of 20. The same year she started nursing. And by the age of 23, she completed her master's degree in nursing from UCLA. Sherri Rasmussen was a highly accomplished nurse, specializing in critical care nursing. She worked her way up to become the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. In November 1985, just a few months before her death, she married a mechanical engineer named John Ruetten. The couple lived in the Van Nuys suburb of California and appeared to be happily starting their lives together. On the morning of February 24, 1986, John left for work, while Sherri called in sick due to a back injury she had sustained while doing aerobics. The first indication that something was wrong came at 9:45 a.m., when a neighbor noticed that the couple's garage door had been left open. At around 10 a.m., John tried to call his wife at home. It was the first of several unanswered calls he would make to Sherri during the course of the day. At 12:30 p.m., a maid cleaning a nearby apartment heard what she thought were people arguing and then something falling. When John returned from work, he found the garage door open, and the BMW he had bought Sherri as an engagement gift was missing. John then entered his home and found Sherri dead on the living room floor. She had been shot 3 times in the chest. When detectives started processing the scene, they found signs that Sherri had struggled with her killer, including a broken vase, a bloody handprint next to the burglar alarm's panic button, and toppled furniture. They also found electronic appliances that had been gathered and piled together on the floor. This led detectives to conclude that Sherri had interrupted a burglary and been killed by the burglar. The suspect then fled the scene in her BMW. The car was found abandoned a week later, but provided no new evidence. 2 men had allegedly been seen attempting break-ins in the neighborhood around the time of Sherri's death, which cemented the theory of a burglary gone wrong. The autopsy showed that Sherri had been shot 3 times with a .38 caliber gun. Experts determined that the ammunition used was Federal .38J+P, a type commonly used by law enforcement at the time. In addition to the bullet wounds, Sherri also had defensive wounds, indicating she had fought back. She also had a bruise on her face caused by the muzzle of a gun. And investigators found a bite mark on her arm, from which they collected a DNA swab. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, detectives quickly assumed that Rasmussen had interrupted a burglary. Sherri was one of 831 people murdered in Los Angeles in 1986, and overworked detectives were happy to take the evidence at face value. They noted that her car had been stolen and the condominium was in disarray, lending credibility to this theory. However, some details raised red flags that were overlooked. For instance, Sherri had clearly put up a fierce fight, a level of resistance unusual in a random burglary. Not only had the killer left the electronic appliances behind, but they had also left all of Sherri's jewelry. In fact, the only item that seemed to be missing was the couple's marriage license, an item with no monetary value to a burglar. Despite these clues, the case went cold. Due to the limitations of forensic technology at the time, the DNA from the bite mark was collected, but not tested. The focus on the burglary narrative prevented the investigation from considering other motives or suspects. While the case languished in cold case files, Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, always harbored suspicions that his daughter had not been killed by a robber. He believed that she had been targeted and killed in a premeditated murder, and he even provided detectives with a suspect, Stephanie Lazarus. At the time of the murder, Lazarus was a respected officer with the LAPD, which may have shielded her from scrutiny. When John Ruetten was an undergraduate at UCLA, he met fellow student, Stephanie Lazarus. Between 1981 and 1984, John and Stephanie were involved in a sexual relationship. John considered it casual, while Stephanie claimed to be deeply in love with him. She was devastated when she found out that John had developed a serious relationship with Sherri. In August 1985, Stephanie wrote to John's mother, saying, "I'm truly in love with John and the past year has really torn me up." Stephanie did not accept John's rejection and continued to come to his apartment and ask him for favors. He also came to the apartment when Sherri was there alone, and she would come in her uniform carrying a gun. According to Rasmussen's family, Lazarus had harassed and confronted Sherri on multiple occasions prior to the murder, warning her to back off from Ruetten. The situation made Sherri extremely uncomfortable, and shortly before her death, she told her father that she feared Lazarus was stalking her. However, detectives investigating the case did not pursue the possibility of a personal vendetta, nor did they consider Lazarus a suspect in 1986. The first breakthrough in the case only came in 2004. By this time, DNA technology had advanced, and the LAPD began testing samples from cold cases. Criminalist Jennifer Francis tested the DNA from saliva taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. While she could not match the DNA to a suspect, she made the surprising discovery that the person who bit Sherri was female. As the vast majority of burglars are male, this new discovery cast doubt on the initial motive behind the killing. Francis discovered that the Rasmussen family had suspicions about Stephanie Lazarus, who had apparently harassed Sherri before the murder. However, when Francis took her concerns to her supervising detective, she was shut down and told that the LAPD officer was not involved in the murder. Other detectives also refused to investigate one of their own, and once again the case went cold. Then in 2009, Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba were assigned to review the case. Because of the DNA evidence indicating the suspect might be a woman, they decided that the original investigation was flawed, and they started over. As their investigation advanced, they realized that the evidence was inconsistent with a burglary, especially one committed in broad daylight. The apartment where the murder occurred was in the middle of a gated community. It would have been much easier for a burglar to target one of the surrounding units. Additionally, Sherri's jewelry box was in plain sight, but had been ignored. The pile of electronic appliances was also concerning. On the record player placed on top of the pile was a thumb-shaped bloodstain. The killer had worn gloves, but the blood suggested that the equipment had only been collected and stacked after the attack on Sherri. If Sherri had interrupted a burglary, the killer would have left immediately. They would not have first killed Sherri, then collected the appliances, only to leave them behind. This suggested that the murder was staged to look like a robbery. Detectives then turned their focus to females with motives to kill Sherri. Lazarus' name resurfaced when investigators connected her history with Ruetten and the hostile interaction she had with Sherri. Though Lazarus had no prior criminal history, her connections to the victim were too significant to ignore. Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba kept their investigation into Lazarus a secret. By that time, Lazarus was a detective working art theft cases with the Commercial Crimes Division. She had made a name for herself after recovering a statue stolen from Carthay Circle. When they took a closer look at Stephanie Lazarus, they discovered that at the time of the murder, she owned a Smith & Wesson Model 49, a .38 caliber revolver compatible with the ammunition used in the murder. They also discovered that 13 days after the murder, Lazarus had reported the weapon stolen. Nuttall and Barba did not want to alert Lazarus to the investigation, so they decided to get her DNA without obtaining a warrant. To do so, they followed her when she was off duty. They then collected a discarded cup she had been drinking from and tested it for DNA. The results were conclusive. Stephanie Lazarus' DNA matched the evidence found on Sherri Rasmussen's body. In June 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested and charged with the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. During her trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case built on the DNA evidence, the history of Lazarus' obsession with John Ruetten, and the aggressive confrontations she had with Sherri Rasmussen before her death. Lazarus had used her police training to stage the murder as a botched robbery, a detail that had misled the original investigators. In March 2012, Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. the LAPD faced criticism for its handling of the case, including accusations of bias in failing to investigate one of their own. The case raised questions about conflicts of interest in police investigations and whether Lazarus' status as an officer affected the initial inquiry. Today, the story of Sherri Rasmussen's murder is not just one of personal tragedy, but also of how justice can be delayed, but not denied.